So I'm just going to begin sharing my screen. We're going to pull up this slide right now, just showing that we are entering webinar 45. For those of you who are new to this OpenChain webinar series, what we do here is we look at topics directly related to open source license compliance and security compliance and related topics such as export control, such as supply chain process management, etc., etc. However, during the webinar series, we also do things related to the broader topic of the industry and substantial developments that can drive it forward. So today we're taking one of those broader views, and we're going to look at an interesting project in one of our critical supply chain industries. We're going to look at the software-defined vehicle project at the Eclipse Foundation. As you may know, if you're familiar with OpenChain, we have a lot of automotive companies involved in what we do. So on our board, we've got companies like Toyota and BMW and Bosch. And in our ecosystem, we've got pretty much everyone else as well. The reason for that is obvious. We're maintaining the ISO standard for open source license compliance. We also maintain a de facto industry standard for open source security compliance. And of course, our good friends in automotive are very concerned with getting things right. The software-defined vehicle project came onto our radar a little while ago and got everyone very excited. Naturally, cars are becoming more and more driven by software. We're very familiar with some of the projects out there that have been working on software in areas like IVI for many years. But as software goes deeper into the automobile, and open source in particular goes deeper, people want to talk about that and understand what's going on. So our community said, hey, go find out more about this. So we did, and Michael from Eclipse is joining us to brief us on software-defined vehicle. Will let us know about it. He'll be on the line to do some follow-up questions. This call, of course, is being recorded like all of our webinars and will be made available to the broader global community. So those of you who are currently in bed and not listening live will be able to listen at your leisure. Before we get started, I'm going to do what we always do and show our antitrust policy notice. This is to be found in full on the Linux Foundation website. And long story short, it provides the framework for us to discuss collaboration in a way that makes sure everyone at the table is comfortable. Oh, hey there. We've got more and more people turning up. Now, we're going to dive right in. People are here to find out about software-defined vehicle and not listen to me. I'm going to pass over to Michael to introduce himself, perhaps say a word or two about Eclipse, and then zoom in to letting us know about this software-defined vehicle project, make sure our community is briefed, and provide a platform for us to disseminate that knowledge further into the supply chain. Michael, over to you.
Yes, so thanks for the warm words and for the welcoming and giving me the chance to present the SDV community, or speaking on behalf of the SDV community at the Eclipse Foundation. As I said, I think, strongly believe that we are onto something, and I hope at the end of the presentation you may share the same view. So let me share my slide deck. I hope you can hear and see what I'm sharing right now.
It's looking good.
Camera.
We got it.
So you still see everything, hopefully?
Yeah, no, it's perfect.
I need to switch to my presentation control. Here we go. Okay, as I said, let me start a little with at least 2 or 3 slides to explain a little bit of the Eclipse Foundation. So interestingly, and I can connect this directly to my own history, I'm not an open source guy. I have been for about 20 years in automotive software business development, so in various positions. And I think before I joined the Eclipse Foundation, beginning of last year, I worked for Alibaba and Alibaba Cloud here in Germany. And I was responsible for a couple of reasons that Alibaba Cloud onboarded the Gaia X initiative. Maybe some of you have heard about this one, especially if you're coming from Europe, as the day one member. And I like the idea of digital sovereignty in Europe very much, so that we in Europe would set a set of rules according to our values. and everyone who's willing to follow that set of rules would be welcome to work on a joint ecosystem for cloud, for automotive, and others. And at the same time, for a couple of reasons, the Eclipse Foundation decided to move from the US to Europe. And since beginning of last year, the Eclipse Foundation is a Europe-based ASBL nonprofit registered in Belgium under European law. So that's where I thought, hey, that's a nice fit, right? I like that idea of digital serenity. I think that could be valuable for building the future technology ecosystem, or support this one at least in Europe. I have two sons. I was asking myself, how can I make sure that they have let's say a job and something to work on about 20 to 30 years from now. And to understand a little bit better why the Eclipse Foundation did that move is for sure based in our strategic membership, right? So we have, I think, quite interesting mix between the regions, and we have also quite interesting mix between different industries. So in Europe, we have corporates like Bosch and Mercedes and SAP as big corporates, not only from the software domain, but also from the industrial domain. We have the major German research organizations, DLR and Fraunhofer, but also the European Space Agency as a strategic member. At the same time, we have I would say, the usual suspects from the US, big software companies like IBM, Microsoft, Oracle, and Red Hat. And we also have a couple of strategic partners from Asia with Fujitsu and Huawei. So all in all, an interesting mix with a clear, let's say, center of gravity in Europe. And so that was very helpful over the last 2 years to engage us in a couple of these initiatives. I'm not sure all of them at the end will be successful. I think there's a lot of struggle by the approach some of them are taking, but at least I see we're at least today home for initiatives when it comes to open source, like Gaia-X, Catena-X, which is another huge automotive collaboration in the space of supply chain. We onboard the open source projects by the Industrial Digital Twin Association. That's mainly everything about the asset administration shell. And there are other ongoing discussions around this digital serenity-based European discussions. I think what's very interesting to understand from the Eclipse Foundation side, I think we may be the least dogmatic. Don't get me wrong, as I said, I don't have a 100 years track record. So what I can feel that the Eclipse Foundation is very much about supporting the industrial ecosystem to collaborate in the open. And if you talk to these industrial players, and I had the pleasure to at least talk about 100 different organizations for SDV in the last 6 to 8 months, and it turns out that's for sure for them, there needs to be a way to earn money, right? And I think so the strong focus here is when we talk about SDV also later on, to build a common platform which could be used across the industry for the non-differentiating parts, but there has to be room above what we call the value line, where companies are still able to earn money, right? They're doing open source sometimes with a very strategic approach and very, very focused view on building this kind of platform, which then enables other features from their side to earn the money. And I think we strongly believe that this is important in the ecosystem where we are active, that we accept that companies also needs to earn money. So that's all about the Eclipse Foundation. Now I would like to start to talk a little bit about the Software-Defined Vehicle Working Group. Here's maybe some of the interesting reasoning why initially a group of companies decide to start just an initiative. In a couple of discussions, or if you go to conferences, quite often hear that automotive software failed to master software. And interestingly, I have a complete different opinion on this one. I think if you think about that now, software is on the street for about 20 years, and that a modern car, according to the figures by VW, may contain 100 million lines of code. It's not too bad when, for example, comes to safety. Right on the left side, you see the number of accidents over the time and the number of driven mileage in Germany. That's figures from the German government agency, the Bundesamt für Straßenwesen. So they are taking care about these statistics. And as you can see, over the last 20 years, the number of fatalities in the road traffic decreased, despite that the complexity of the software in the car was heavily increasing. So there seems to be a connection here, and that the software developed for the car helped to reduce the number of accidents and others. So software in the car is a success story when we talk about safety. The bad is for the future, the complexity, if we talk about maybe level 5 autonomous driving, will at least triple some forecasts even say 5 times as high as today. So VW, for example, from the slide, as you can see, is forecasting that level 5 car will have roughly 1 billion lines of code in the car, which is quite significant effort. And the question is, who will develop that software? Who will master that complexity in the future? We already struggle with the complexity, and also with the automotive industry struggles with mastering the complexity and finding the right numbers of developers. So how would we be able to do something which is 5 times as big as we are today? And the ugly stuff, especially for the automotive companies, are, as I said, they have a huge track record in safety, but they somehow missed to develop skills, let's say, in features which are now more end customer focused. Safety is important and has been a selling argument for cars about 10, 15 years ago. For 10, 15 years ago, you have been able to sell a car if it has a 5-star in CIP test results. Nowadays, if your car don't have 5 stars in CIP test results, you cannot sell that car anymore. That means safety has become a certain kind of hygienic factor, right? So, or commodity. So you have to have safety, but you cannot sell a car any longer just because you have some very great safety features. Nobody's taking too much care about safety. So that means the main focus and the main expertise of the automotive industry has somehow become a hygienic factor. And what is new and latest and greatest, why people purchase a certain brand, a certain car model, that's something where automotive industry to some extent missed to build up capabilities. And now they're doing it they try to invest heavily into this one. You can see every other month announcements by companies like Carrier or Mercedes that they would join, or that they would hire another 4,000, 5,000, 8,000 software developers. I personally doubt that the number of people in your software development teams necessarily directly relates to the quality of the software and the strengths of the software. But at least you can see that all these companies are heavily struggling with increasing complexity and trying to fill the gap when it comes to software, which at the end of the day would make end customers buying their products. Another thing, what we see, what I quite often heard, if we talk about software-defined vehicles, that there's no real collaboration in the automotive industry, which from my perspective is also not true. But the prevailing model in the past for collaboration was collaborating on standards. And interestingly, OpenChain is one of these collaborations as well, right? It's a standard or a specification. And what I write here on the left side is explicitly not true maybe for things like OpenChain. Here, my observations are mainly focusing on standards which are accompanied by later implementations of the specification of standard. And if you look at these kind of standardization efforts, there are a couple of observations you could make. The first of all, clearly, and that's maybe all the things you experience in OpenChain, this kind of specification needs to be based on consensus. So all organizations finally need to agree that the specific version of a document or of a specification is the specification which should be released. That's on the one side great, because you get the consensus, you get the buy-in from all the organizations. At the same time, it slows down processes quite often, right? So you're really dependent on the slowest organization in the group of supporting organizations. So standards or specifications usually tend not to be the fastest way of doing a collaboration. Then sometimes you see that you have a need to compromise on technical level. That means, let's assume you have 2 technical solutions for a given problem or challenge, and the community cannot agree on the one or the other. So just to make sure that you still can agree on a standard, because you need the condense, people start to compromise and work. While compromise in politics are quite nice way to do things, I think compromises in technology are usually not better than the individual initial ideas and approaches. So sometimes this kind of compromising weakens the technical quality or the technical approach of a standard or specification. Then, if you start on a greenfield specification without underlying implementations, you tend to define too many corner cases, which are at the end of the day are not needed in implementation or while adopting the standard. You usually have a very early exclusion of technology alternatives, as I said. So usually if you write the standard, you only came up with one final technology, and maybe competing technologies at the beginning of the discussion have already been excluded. And so you cannot really develop the full potential of these alternatives. So that's usually something which is not very helpful. And especially in the automotive industry, and that's what I tried to sketch on the right side with a pyramid. And that was what I personally experienced when I was very much into AUTOSAR, that not the individual organizations which work on the standard finally adopt to the standard, but the standard is adopted to the needs of usually OEMs, the car manufacturers, because they are in this pyramid at the very top, and they finally pay all the money to the supply chain. So they usually can force a standard, if it's just a standard for automotive, to fulfill their needs. But for example, as it happened with AUTOSAR, at the end you have a BMW flavor, a Mercedes flavor, an VW flavor, and maybe even a Toyota flavor for AUTOSAR. So the standard is not used as a standard where all the organizations use the same standard, but there are certain balconies for each and every OEM. This is now a concrete example from AUTOSAR, which just a little bit decreases the value of the standard which has been done. So all in all, I think there have been successful collaboration models on standard in the past, still now. One final remark on that slide, you see the small asterisks on open. I think it's very important to understand that standardization organizations define open, the word open, differently than open source organizations. Open in standards usually means open to participate, so everyone is allowed to join and can contribute to standard, but usually the results are limited to members of the consortia. Whereas open in open source, and most likely don't have to tell you that, mean that you are also open to use the results without any permissions. So there's a significant difference between the word open in standards and open in open source. I think it's always important to keep that in mind. Having all of this said, what do we plan to do differently in software-defined vehicle? On the left side, you see the classic approach, which I was referring to already in my observations on the previous slides. And I think that classical approach is very much aligned to the traditional V model development of software, right? So you start with specification, then start implementation, then to test and validation, and you do this in a very strict sequential way. And it turns out nowadays that and if you compare this to other industries like cloud and AI, that this is not the normal mode of operation. This is very successful technology approaches. So we thought about what if we would not start from this classical approach, but we would start with the code first approach. So the idea was here to say, hey, we don't want to start with architecture discussions. We don't want to start with specification discussions, but we want to start with software. So the first things we did when we started the working group, and I have a slide on this later on, is we reached out to all involved parties and asked them, what kind of project could you immediately open source? And we have, I think, an impressive list of projects. Again, I will show them later, but that's what the idea. So we assume that other than to the standard organizations or standard activities I mentioned previously, that we are not consensus driven. So we would be completely fine to host two competing projects within the working group, the software-defined vehicle working group. And I think there are three potential outcomes how this could develop, right? So both projects could coexist. We're talking in the community about the concept of distribution. So there will not be the one and only software-defined vehicle working group software stack in the future. But we are thinking more of distributions like Linux distributions. And one Linux distribution can have one window manager, and another Linux distribution could have another window manager. And we would like to have the same approach here. So we can have two competing projects and both can coexist and maybe by the competition be very innovative. We would be fine if the project just decide to collaborate, which maybe from an open source perspective would be the best way of doing things. But there's also a chance that there's a winner takes it all approach, right? So that one project will prevail the other and the other will just disappear. But the interesting thing here is that this would happen just by adoption. So projects has to prove their value. And that's maybe the difference, as I tried to explain to the standardization activities before. You would make that decision between the different projects or technologies from that project at a very early stage without even seeing what would be the implementation. And we try to defer that decision to a later point in time where the projects can prove by implementation and by testing which approach may be the better one. Or, as I said, maybe both of them would coexist. As we said, since we don't have this top-down approach, we don't have a fully defined scope. So we more define areas where we would like to see projects from and activities in. The one area is for sure the software in the car. We call this area SDV Edge. And that's all the software from the operating system up to containerized application deployment methods. And we clearly target QM and also safety-related software. So in a recent talk, I said the success of software-defined vehicle, I hope, can be measured that we would be able to have at least some of the components which are developed under the software-defined vehicle working group in a serious development, in a serious car, maybe in 3 to 5 years from now. That would be a real success story, because we don't want to develop R&D code. We want to develop, and we would like to work on code which really makes it to the car at the end of the day. The second domain would be the cloud part. Everything now is connected to the cloud, and how these things can work together. And then we talk about, let's say, containerized app deployment methods and other things. And the third area we want to focus on is the tooling part. If you look at the tooling part today, that's hugely and I think overly complex and in the automotive industry. So the traditional automotive industry has developed over the last 20 years, and I think it's way over complex and way too inefficient, because there are too many organizations which just earn money by this complexity. That was not a problem for the last 20 years when every organization in automotive did the same approach to software. So there was no cost advantages on the one or the other side. But nowadays, with new market entrants from the Chinese market, maybe with new market entrants like Tesla and Rivian from the US and others, there's a huge pressure on cost when it comes to software development. And I think we cannot afford this very complex, very effort-consuming approach to tooling for development in the automotive software domain. So I think we need to find ways to unify that tooling, to simplify how to maintain it. If you remember, or maybe a couple of people in the call are familiar with the automotive software domain. So usually each and every project and combination of an OEM and tier one has a unique tool chain. That because each and every OEM has a preferred tool chain, each and every tier one has a preferred tool chain. And for each and every project, these tool chains have then to rebuild, needs to some customization effort. And the tool chain needs to be maintained for 10 to 15 years. As long as there are cars on the road, for liability reasons, you need to maintain that tool chain, right? So if you have then for each car model and each bigger ECU, like infotainment system or driver assistance systems, to maintain an individual unique tool chain, that's a huge effort. And I think that's not really something which the automotive industry can afford in the future. Having that said, so we have these three areas, but we also clearly state we cannot neglect what's out there. So we don't have plans to reinvent things which are done by AUTOSAR. We don't plan to reinvent things which have done by Covesa. If you think about the two domains I mentioned, the software in the car and the software in the cloud, already today, some of the projects we have onboarded use the vehicle signal specification from Covesa and W3C. And we are in close contact with the AUTOSAR consortium. AUTOSAR announced a couple of months meanwhile ago that they would like to have an open up strategy, that AUTOSAR artifacts can be used from open source projects and similar things. So we have all these discussions, and I think we need all these discussions, because I think we would not add value to the automotive industry if we raise the impression that this is just another automotive initiative. It's more the opposite. So I personally see, and a couple of people in the community share what we are talking here, that the software-defined vehicle working group could be an initiative of initiatives, which puts together all these things which usually focus on a certain aspect of the software stack into something which would be, I would not call it an end-to-end solution, that would be way too much, but it would be a solution which could be easily consumable by the people who finally would need to develop the applications and the software, which then is experienceable by the car buyer, by the end customer. Having that said, so where are we today? So we are now 27 organization which has onboarded in the last, we started in February, so now it's about 9 months, which from my understanding is a huge success. We have right now 6 more in the pipeline, so I hope that maybe by end of the year we can end up at 33 to 35 members of the software-defined vehicle initiative. And we have a very interesting timeline, right? So that's not the result of, let's say, 3-4 years on the road. No, we started this working group and we had the first steering committee meeting in March this year. We provided the paperwork to the organizations beginning of February. We allowed them 3.5 weeks to join. for the first steering committee. So we already had 13 organizations joining for the first round. And if you may be a little bit familiar with automotive company processes, I think 3.5 weeks to sign a strategic membership, which is about 200K euro a year. That's something which it's not easy to achieve. And we did not stop at this point in time. So then we had our first and our second contribution day, where again, we put a lot of pressure on the organizations to open source some of their software. And I think running obviously to their processes to open up IP and assets which has been initially developed internally seems to be even more difficult than just getting them some money paid for the working group. So we had a lot of discussions, and some of the projects I would show at the end are mainly based on what the project we could onboard fastest, where we could run through our internal approval process in the fastest manner. And at the end, I think just the last 6 weeks, so we had a first, I would not, Hackaday is a big word for the first event we had. I would more call it a plug fest or more code work. So all the involved project met at our EclipseCon in Ludwigsburg for half a day and did some collaboration discussions and collaboration work. And then we had a very nice, really very, very nice hackathon 3 weeks ago in Berlin, together with the Bosch Connected World, Bosch Connected Experience. I have a nice video on this later on, so I will not talk too much about this one. But I think we have with this 4 events this year, and we had usually a couple of hundred participants at each of that event. That was a nice success. All of these organizations finally agreed to work on our governance principles. I think, especially in the automotive industry, it's very important to provide a certain governance. And I think maybe the most important aspect for our community in software-defined vehicles is vendor neutrality. So it is clear to everyone that there's not a single organization which plays a special role in the setup, right? For sure, we have organizations right now who are engaging more than others, but that's fine. That's what open source projects are usually all about. But from a governance perspective, from a control perspective, there's not a single organization which has more control than any others. And at the same time, being an open source organization, we have the principles of transparency and openness. It means, similar to what I was saying about the digital sovereignty aspect of the European ecosystem, openness for us means every organization who's willing to work according to the Eclipse Foundation governance principles, for example, our code of conduct, is welcome to join. There's no gatekeeping for organizations to join the Eclipse Foundation and the Software-Defined Vehicle Working Group. And transparency means we have a couple of communication channels. I have an overview slide at the end where all the decisions, all the meeting minutes from the steering committees and others are published, so everyone is able to see why certain decisions has been made. And I think that's a quite interesting or quite valuable standard. Next to this, we define 2 more principles for the Software-Defined Vehicle Working Group. The first one, as I already explained, code first. We really would like to start from source code, not from specification, not from architecture, but really from code first. Just to add on this one, we defined 9 principles for the working group. We still need to publish them, but we already agreed on them internally. And one of these principles is called define or work on specification based on proven implementations. That means we always think about that we should have an implementation first, and based on the usefulness of that implementation, then we can define specifications needed. And the second one, that maybe also a little bit surprisingly, that's active participation. As I said, I had about 100 calls over the last 6 months with organization which wants to join the Software-Defined Vehicle Working Group. And a couple of them has been there just interest out of a fear of missing out moment. And I think that organization we would not want and need at the table right now. So if you are interested, but mainly more of this fear of missing out motivation, as I said, we are transparent. So every discussion, every decision is published on the mailing list, on the various communication channels. So there's no need to join just because you think you could miss something. We really are looking, and we're really striving for an organization which wants to actively engage. I think that's very important to understand. Now, the next slide, I have a video. And I need to understand, maybe you can give me feedback if you can see and hear the video. If not, I have no clue how to fix this then, but then it's just 90 seconds, so it's not too long. It's about the hackathon. Please, if you could send something to the chat or speak into the microphone. If you can't hear, if there are any problems, just inform me, please, and I will stop it.
Okay, I'll flag it in the chat. We can see it, but not hear it.
In person, more than 300 developers coming together and working on very important topics.
We have this collaborative spirit, this open sourciness that you can feel everywhere.
You learn so much stuff and so many new topics in such a short time.
You have to iterate really fast. You have to code really fast.
It's not only about software development, it's really about combining both things together, hardware and software.
I come from a software background, but when you have the hardware, you have something feasible, something you actually can touch.
You have just a broad range of devices you could use from all the different partners.
Absolutely about the people.
This is a great platform for people to come together.
Crazy hacking. Everybody's so focused on things.
Really, really fun.
Lots of coffee, lots of mate, and not that much sleep.
Okay, so these videos are all available on YouTube. So if you just would, that's the second one. Honestly, I showed you the wrong one. And why I showed you the wrong one, that's easy to explain. I think the hackathon itself, there were two hackathons on site, one organized by Bosch on a building IoT hackathon. The second one was about the software-defined vehicle initiative. So the group of developers you could see here split more or less into two groups, one for the software-defined vehicle and one for the IoT, building IoT hackathon. And at the end of the video, there was a pitch event, which then was hosted by the Bosch Connected World, which happened next door, next to the Bosch Connected Experience. There was about 800 to 1,000 participants at the Bosch Connected World looking at the pitch event for the hackathon. That was really great, and it was really interesting to see how the community is engaged here. So let me continue. No, sorry, I need to find my control. Just give me a second. So these are the projects we have onboarded so far. So that's a list of 12 projects. And interesting, as I said, we need to take into account that other things are out there. We already have 3 projects out of the 12, which has a very close relation to AUTOSAR. For example, we have a project by Carriot called Summer, which is in SumIP implementation in Rust. We have by ZF a component called Adaptive Cruise Control demo application for adaptive AUTOSAR. And we have another application, Ambient Light Services, which is an AUTOSAR classic application by T-Systems. So a lot of very interesting content in these 12 projects. Most of them are meanwhile also really available in open source. That means there are in an open source GitHub repositories. We have a couple of projects from the second contribution day, end of September. We're currently in the onboarding process. We also have 2 new project proposals. One is called Eclipse RHE, which is, let's say, a tooling which is developed by Carriot, which allows the complete modeling of a car and would then generate AUTOSAR configuration files to configure the complete car communication between the couple of 10 or even hundreds ECUs. And the other interesting project, it's currently the proposal stage of the project called Eclipse Pumpkin. Don't ask me for the name, that was decided by the project community. And the interesting stuff here is that this is based on a public funded German research project called Software Defined Car. And there's a strong support right now by the government in Germany, but we're also in discussions on the EU level to open source these kind of results so that everyone can use them and to put them into perspective with other open source components to build something meaningful. So you don't just have the research results from the individual research projects, but also connect them to other initiatives and other components. Finally, and that's where it all also connects to the meeting today, OpenChain. I think our team made a self-assessment. I think, and Shane, correct me if that's the wrong wording. I'm happy to learn about this one. So we made an assessment, and according to this assessment, all the projects at the Eclipse Foundation, not only the software-defined vehicle, but all the projects at the Eclipse Foundation, whenever they follow our processes, would be OpenChain conformant. So that means our processes are established in a way that we more or less, by following the release process of the processes to make releases, we would generate this SBOM and other artifacts which are needed to finally claim OpenChain conformance, which is nice, which is highly appreciated by the community, because that really helps also for internal discussions with stakeholders, let's say the legal department and others, that the project then can easily prove that they can follow the ISO 5230, if I remember right. So that's really value to our project, that they can showcase OpenChain conformance. Finally, I would like to have one or two more slides on our governance structures. I always talk about working group and projects and mix them up to some extent. To be completely clear, a working group at the Eclipse Foundation is complementary to projects. Working groups are there to do stuff like ecosystem development, like the hackathon I just showcased. The working group is a place to develop specifications. That's mainly due to more complex IP flow compared to open source projects. And the working group is there to do cross-project alignments. But at the end of the day, from a governance perspective, working groups and projects are independent. So a working group has no direct impact on a project and vice versa. And projects usually declare non-exclusive interest in a working group, and all the vice versa. So a project at the Eclipse Foundation can be, we call this, associated with a couple of working groups. And the working group for sure can associate with a couple of projects, otherwise cross-project collaboration would not make sense. But to state this very clearly, these are different vehicles to do things by. The projects are the places where people come together, developers come together to develop software, and a project is a working group is complementary to this, the place where people come together to promote technologies, to do this cross-project alignment and other things. So there's no notion of working group owning a project. Working groups express non-exclusive interest in project, and the union of committers from that's more formal point. I should maybe remove this one. That's from my side. Thank you very much for your time, for listening to what we're currently doing at SCV. If you're interested, reach out to me. I think, let me check. I claim that I have a slide with all the information. Let me skip the other slides. And here we go. This is the slide where you have the different communication channels. We have the website for the working group. We have an official waiting list where you can subscribe to. There's no need to be a member of the software-defined vehicle group. The same is true for Slack workspace. If you would like to join that Slack workspace, just send me a message. I will send you a link to the Slack workspace. We have a couple of video conferences and community calls which are open and not restricted to membership. So there are a couple, if you're interested, a couple of ways to interact with the community. And as I said, we are currently onto something, right? We have a huge support, not only by the developers. Maybe you've seen the slides, I skipped a little bit. We all have very strong support by senior management from the various organizations which are active at the software-defined vehicle, which currently do a great job in promoting this initiative, among others. And so I'm sure we'll see at least one more OEM next to Carrier and Toyota in the next couple of weeks. We will see another hyperscaler joining this initiative. We see a couple of more tier ones joining this initiative. So this will be really hopefully relevant for building an open source ecosystem for the automotive industry. Thanks a lot. And if there are any questions, I'm happy to take questions right now.
Fantastic. Thank you, Michael. Everyone, you're automatically muted on entry, but you can unmute yourselves. And also you can ask questions in the chat. And Michael, thank you so much for taking time. And also, as you said, it's quite an interesting and important development that not only software-defined vehicle, but all of the Eclipse Foundation projects are using OpenChain conformant processes.
Absolutely.
It's historic, actually. It's a hell of a thing.
let me explain one thing. I as a sales guy, who I am from my past experiences, right? I would like for us to push this much more to the open, because especially in the industry, like automotive industry, that's an important aspect, right? I think that's something. Developers usually don't like processes too much, but if you follow the process and get a real value at the end by following that process, like OpenChain conformance, that's something which really is where even developers say, hey, that's a good idea to follow these kind of processes, right? And at the end of the day, processes are not there to just annoy developers. Processes have a certain value, especially then from a governance perspective for large corporates. And so having that process in place is a valuable asset.
Absolutely. And of course, the end goal here is that we have that long-term sustainable management of the supply chain, including, let's say, a project, to make sure that we have less remediation, confusion, or in 10 years, just sitting down and going, what on earth happened? How did we get here?
Yeah, absolutely.
I see Stephen has his hand up. Stephen, over to you.
Thank you for the presentation, Michael. That was fabulous. A couple of questions. The first, since this is an OpenChain call, do you mean that all the Eclipse projects will now have SBOMs already available for them?
Usually the SBOMs are generated when the project runs through the release to the release process. So usually they don't have them every day, but as soon as they would like to do an official release, that's part of our release process to set up the SBOM, which is then in return auto checked by our IP team, for example. So yeah, so all the projects should, when they have a first official release, have an SBOM associated to them.
Okay, that's excellent news. I'll have to look at see how those are distributed.
Absolutely.
Second question, related to your presentation, what effect do you think this is going to have on things like the open organizations such as AutoSAR? Do you expect to see them becoming more open in the open source respect?
So I think the interesting thing with AutoSAR, as I said, I'm not sharing secrets here. One of the challenges of AutoSAR is, on the one side, their structure. There are nine core members who owns the legal entity which operates AutoSAR. That's the German GBR. And at the same time, since AutoSAR is now 20 years on the road, I think that they celebrate the 20th anniversary next year. So about 10 to 15% of the IP at AutoSAR right now is not clear who owns that IP. So companies have become bankrupt. There was mergers and acquisitions and other things. So for about 10 to 15% of the AutoSAR IP, it's not clear who owns that IP. So there are strong voices within AutoSAR saying we should open source everything. So all the specifications, we should not restrict this to just AutoSAR members and to certain use cases. We really should open up AutoSAR. But at the same time, due to this legal risk, there seems to be a couple of organizations which say, especially the 9 core members, say, no, we are not willing to take that legal risk to be sued for IP infringement and others. There is a strong, that's what I feel, don't get me wrong. I'm looking on AutoSAR from an external perspective, right? But from the discussion we see, I can feel that there is a strong willingness, at least of some of the participants here, especially on OEM and tier 1 level, to open up AutoSAR. Yeah.
That's great news. Thanks.
Everyone else, this is your chance. You can either raise your hand or just jump right in with any questions. While we're waiting for people there, Michael, I do have one question. You seem to have a lot of movement with this. I was just wondering what type of reaction, if any, you've had thus far from the Korean and Chinese automotive supply chains.
Yeah. So we have a first Chinese member with Pateo. We have another, let's say, US-based organization, FutureWay, which is, but from my understanding, is owned by a Chinese company. Honestly, one of the things I love today is seeing so many colleagues from Asia. So I lived for 3 years in China, worked 4 years for a Chinese company. So I have a certain heart in Asia. So when I was responsible for the AutoSAR business development at a company called Electrobit, I traveled, I think, at least 20 to 30 times to Japan and Korea. I like these countries very much. And having more engagement there, that's something we are looking for right now. So this has been initially a European-centric initiative just by the initial members. But now we see growing interest from all over the world, although from the US. So we are in discussion with at least one US-based OEM, for example. I will be a CES to have a couple of discussions there on software-defined vehicle. And we already have Toyota as a member, the software-defined vehicle. So we have a certain footprint, but for sure, having a bigger footprint from these regions would be very helpful at the end. And that is the goal, is that we would have a solution for the complete global automotive industry, because we believe that only this really would make sense for everyone. And by the way, that's also one of the reasons why we started as we started, right? I received a couple of questions. Why have we been starting for technology-wise on a greenfield? There's so much technology out. You could have easily built a stack and say that's the chosen stack. But I think the initial companies like Bosch and Microsoft, who initially drove this one, were saying, if we define already a technology stack, there's a high risk that other organizations don't want to join because that technology stack does not fit into their expectations and other things. So being at the very beginning technology agnostic without any kind of predefinition when it comes to technologies and software and other things, that was the main reason for this, was to be open for everyone and make it possible for everyone to join this initiative and then jointly define something together. So having more organizations from Asia or more organizations other from the US, that would be for sure something we would like to see, and that's what we're currently working on.
That makes a lot of sense. Indeed, I'd love to work with you on this. We've got terrific automotive engagement in Japan. We've got great engagement in Germany, and we've got increasing engagement in Korea, where, for instance, Hyundai Motor Group had 4 of its entities announce conformance this year. But China, we're still just getting started on the automotive front, and I'd love to collaborate on that space. We're working with CAICT, CASI on the government side. We're working with the companies like Huawei and so on. But the automotive is a bit of a green field for us, so maybe we can play together there.
Yeah, happy to discuss.
Stephen, your hand is up again. More questions?
Yes, I have another question. So it's also great to see that you're adopting the agile approach, going back to the original internet mantra of rough consensus and working code, effectively.
Yeah.
How does that play in with the functional safety requirements in the SDV.edge stuff?
No, that's a great question. Honestly, I don't have an answer. So, as I said, I'm coming from I headed a global sales team which were responsible for AUTOSAR functional safety, and so I have a certain footprint in functional safety as well. So Electrobit had the first ISO 26262 safety element out of context certified AUTOSAR RES, for example. And if you talk to the safety guys, they say we are nuts. They say without starting from an architecture, you will never achieve safety. And maybe they're right. I hope not, but maybe they're right. And then we need to talk about this one, right? But I think I will be the place where the community exactly discusses these kind of questions. I don't have an answer to this today, but that's for sure, hopefully something that's a discussion we can have in that community. And we try to foster this one. Just to give you an example, next year we'll add 2 more staff on the software-defined vehicle working group. We will have 1 technical writer who will support the projects with writing up-to-date, high-quality documentation to make it easy for others to adopt the projects. And secondly, we start to have a process engineer. This process engineering role should be there to support the project, setting up processes, documentation, whatever it takes, starting from MISRA via ASPICE and others, to help adoption of these projects on real serious projects. Will we have a functional safety certification like safety element out of context ISO 26262 for these open source components? I don't think so. I think that still will be a business case for qualified companies and not necessarily something the open source community will do. But having that discussion, how the projects can prepare to be included in these kind of things, that's for sure something which is useful. And think about the following: this 14 projects we have right now, the 12 project plus the 2 project proposals, has been developed by automotive companies. So they are already familiar with the requirements which are needed to fulfill these kind of requirements, to fulfill safety requirements and other things. So my hope is that at least to some extent, this kind of thinking has been already included in the project development when they were still developed within the individual organizations.
Yeah, I've been watching what's been happening with things like Zephyr, and I've been trying to figure out how things like inner sourcing works with a functional safety environment. And I'm hoping that there's going to be learning coming out of your project in order to show how you can produce something in the open, which is then available to be used as a safety element out of context in something of a functional safety product. So
honestly,
looking forward to it.
Yeah, I assume it's safe to assume that we will not start with a safety project. I'm quite sure. So I would assume that the first things we are doing, if we go into serious development, hopefully in 3 to 5 years, as I said, one of the expressed goals of the community, I assume that this will not be at the very beginning already functional safety related. I hope that we may start with QM to make some experience. Even QM can be very challenging when it comes to processes in the automotive industry. But I'm sure, and at the same time, think about it, I think we have a couple of projects which are not yet associated to the software-defined vehicle working group, stuff like Cyclone DDS and Eclipse ISORIX, which are part of a software stack, which is currently by a company called Apex AI under ISO 26262 certification, certification process. I think what's important here, so about 10 years ago, everyone claimed open source and functional safety are mutually exclusive. Now we see first open source components being part of stacks which are certified according to this safety element out of context approach. And I don't see a reason why we would not be able to achieve this with a larger group of projects. But for sure, there's significant effort into this where the community needs to work on.
Okay, thank you.
Okay, fantastic, Michael. Thank you very much. I'm just pausing to see if anyone has a final question. And if not, we will begin to wrap it up here. Michael, thank you for coming. It's always good to work with you and the team at Eclipse. And I'm looking forward to next steps. Let's see what we can do, especially in China as we scale this stuff outwards. Wrapping up, I just noticed Carlo Piana has a comment that he's joined the working group. Looking forward to sharing a compliance tool chain that's being developed for Eclipse Oniro. We've got Andreas providing his thanks. Dira saying, oh, we have a question from Dira. What would the vision of future ideal automotive industry look like, different from current status quo in adoption of SDF? Oh, so what would SDF change in an ideal world, Michael?
Yeah, let me. Good question. So,
it's a small question.
Absolutely. So what I think, honestly, let me. So in this 100 discussions, I quite often get this argumentation or the question, what would be my business case of the future? And I think, or my statement is usually, I don't think that doing something in open source is the main factor of jeopardizing your existing business model. That's much more external factors like new market entrants and others. And I think open source may give you a chance to build up new business cases. Having that said, I think the traditional automotive industry has at the moment a challenge with the complexity and the variant management of their existing software and all the legacy which has been built over the last 20 years. And I think just to name a figure, there's a guy who has been the head of Audi previously called Ricky Hoody. He was on a conference stating, based on a study by Capgemini, that there are 60 different middlewares out there. Do we think we can reduce the 60 different middlewares to one? No, I don't think that's will be possible. But would we be able to reduce the 60 different middlewares to 5? That would be something we could dream of, right? And reducing the complexity, finding a group of companies working together to decrease cost, decrease complexity, increase the efficiency of reuse and sharing of software. That's what I would think about. Maybe just as a final thought, and maybe that's really a dream, and maybe I'm not sure that's realistic. Maybe you remember that there has been 10 months ago the discussion between VW or CARIAD, BMW and Mercedes about an automotive OS. And while I dislike the notion of operating system, I still think building a joint platform that could be helpful, right? If you see Apple Car, so it's all about getting access to the end customer. And there's more and more the tendency that this access is transferred from the automotive companies to the platform providers like Apple, like Android in China, like Alibaba or Tencent and others. And the question is, how can automotive companies make sure that they still would get access, right? Can they build their own platform? I think, yes, it would be a small platform, maybe just 20 million devices out there compared to billion of devices when we talk about mobile phones. But this 20 million devices would be very special. They would have special hardware like sound system, like screen, like massage seats. And you can build on this one. But when each and every OEM builds this platform by himself, it would be way too small for third parties. And this platform will be only attractive if there are third parties. It might be examples, usually Spotify, right? So would Spotify have a solution for a Mercedes platform, for a BMW platform, for Toyota platform, for a VW platform? No. Maintaining these different versions, that's not a business case for Spotify. But if the automotive industry would be able to agree on a common platform in the non-differentiating part, then it could be, even the number of devices are small, 20 million, maybe 50 million, then it would be still significant enough for third parties to build something on top of that platform and maintain one solution for this platform. So going from the cost perspective, I think that's realistically what we can achieve. If we could achieve this broader idea of building a platform, and let's say, I would not call it white label platform, I would call it an open source platform, where everyone then can build upon their differentiating features, plus being attractive for third-party companies and for third-party services. That's something we may, depending on the support and interest by the community, would be then as an extended or stretch goal, how it is I think called on Kickstarter. That could be an extended goal, and not sure if that's realistic, but I think that could be all the valuable for the automotive industry.
Fantastic.
Sorry for the long answer.
It was one of those questions. There's no easy answer to that.
I agree.
All right. Thank you, Michael. Thank you to everyone who had questions, and thank you to everyone who came. Let's meet again soon. Wrapping up the 45th webinar today. Keep tuned. We'll announce the 46th shortly. Be well, be healthy, be safe. Take care all.
Thank you.
Bye.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.